name's Robin. I'm the director and founder, and basically I am ViziCities. Before I sort of dig into making sense of transportation data, I'd like to give you a bit of context about what ViziCities actually is and actually what it can do. So the original inspiration for ViziCities comes from city building games like SimCity or Cities Skylines, if any of you have played those. And in these games, you create your own sort of fictional cities, and you manage every aspect of them, right down from the very fine detail all the way up to citywide policies. And they also give you a data view, which allows you to peel back your city and sort of get a better idea about how it's performing and more importantly, what's working and what isn't working, so you can actually go in and fix it. It's just a shame that these tools are for fictional cities. So what ViziCities aims to do really is to do the same for real-world cities by keeping a SimCity-like balance between beautiful and practical data visualization, but also having a great user experience at the same time. So the ViziCities platform takes geospatial data as an input. For example, raw sort of OpenStreetMap data like this. And it uses it to generate and visualize real-world interactive cities in a web browser in 3D. So take Manhattan, for example, or London, or anywhere else in the world for that matter, because if the data exists, then you can visualize it within ViziCities. It doesn't have a predefined sort of set of locations within it. And you can do so much more than just look at a city. So instead of using basic visualizations, and instead of just doing sort of things like buildings from OpenStreetMap, you can instead import sort of more sophisticated, higher quality visualizations from models like OBJ formats in Collada. And for example, in this visualization, we're looking at city GML data from Linz in Austria. And you'll notice the much higher level of detail in the buildings, and it's quite subtle, but you'll see like the spire on the church and things like that. And you don't get that in other sort of more simplified data sets because they're like sort of blocks, like Lego blocks. Sort of adds an extra layer of realism. And ViziCities also has dynamic lighting as well, so it allows you to sort of get a more realistic representation of how perhaps sunlight may look and behaves at different times of the day. So while this is pretty, it's a useful tool for giving added sort of context for visualizations that span, say, multiple days or are used at night. You don't always have to have an artistic view either. It can sort of, I'd argue that there'd be more situations that you actually need to look at sort of a more refined sort of approach that you're looking at sort of data visualization. Instead, you need to focus on the data rather than how beautiful it looks. So in this example, this is taking LiDAR information from the Environment Agency to produce a 3D terrain map, which you could then use to do things like flood level analysis or building a tool for citizens to actually interactively raise and lower water levels to actually see how their local area is going to be affected by flooding. And just looking at sort of basic traditional data visualizations like heat maps and chloroplaths, and just getting a better understanding of normal data like pollution and crime and education and census information. So what I'm getting at is ViziCities aims to be as flexible as possible so it can be used in as many situations as possible. So while you may want something visually impressive, say really realistic and something that sort of can wow, like a real estate client, for example, you can do that. You may want something clean and robust to enhance and communicate sort of complex data or analysis that you've performed, or you can do that too. Or you may just want a fun and beautiful way to sort of explore an area in 3D, kind of like Google Earth, and you can do that as well. So it's important to point out that this is all working in a browser, so it requires no plugins. You don't need to install anything. It works out of the box on all modern computers. And this is a massive difference to existing tools out here that do something vaguely similar. And it also works on mobile too. So this is an example from some recent development working on an iPhone. It was not built to work on the iPhone as such, it just did. And by following sort of further optimizations, it's going to work even faster. Now, I just wanted to touch on sort of exactly what ViziCities stands for, because I got asked this a lot during the stand. I wanted to put this slide in just to explain it. There's a for-profit company, and there's the open source platform. So ViziCities is designed and built by myself. There's no huge team behind this, which often surprises people. And as a business, it makes money by doing consultancy around the open source platform. So the whole focus is on building this open source tool for other people to use, but the business is about building things on top of that and using the experience to work with other people. So recently we've been doing work with, say, Thames Water or Transport for London, like looking at internal data that they have and using that to help them make decisions better or faster than they could have done previously. Instead of looking at Excel spreadsheets, they look at something like this. So the rest of the talk, I just want to focus a bit on the transportation data and the visualizations that you can produce using that kind of data and how to better understand that data. So one early example of this, which was done about 3 years ago when the project started, was looking at vehicle AI. So looking at how you could use real road network topology and actually having vehicles move around that world. So in this example, there's basic vehicles that kind of follow basic rules that tell them which roads they can go down, which ones they can't. So simulations like this are valuable in a variety of areas, many of which we've already touched on over the past 2 days, things like traffic analysis or predictions of what might happen should a road network change, say you add a roundabout here or you shut a road here while you do other roadworks. So it's very much like SimCity. But on the other side, at a basic level, you can visualize sort of city-wide transportation networks to get a sense of scale and context within a 3D environment, a sense of scale that you can't really get in 2D. And when combining this kind of data with things like buildings, you suddenly get a much better sense of how the transportation network kind of wiggles and winds its way through the city. By simply adding these buildings, you also get a sort of visual anchor that can help you work out where you are in the city and which direction you're facing. So this technique is used every day when you're kind of walking around the city. You just know where you are, you know which way you're facing because you have that visual reference. So you can also look at these networks in abstract ways. So it doesn't have to be sort of what you would consider a traditional 3D visualization. So in this example, I've taken the same London Underground network that you just saw, but using depth information to actually give you a truer representation of the actual relationship between these stations across the whole network. And all of a sudden, you go from this flat view to something entirely different that some of you have maybe never seen or considered before. And what happens is you suddenly make the invisible parts of the city visible. And by overlaying live vehicle prediction data on top of that, you can actually bring these visualizations to life. So it demonstrates the living, breathing sort of complexity of these transportation networks. And just because you can actually visualize a city doesn't mean you have to. So in this example, I focus in on an individual train with a representation of individual carriages, in fact. And it looks fun, but it's also a powerful way to do things like visualizing per vehicle data. So things like vehicle state and maintenance and stuff like that, and getting an easy to understand sort of representation of those data points. You can apply the same technique to other networks as well. So in this visualization, you're looking at the entire London bus network. And it's using a technique that basically highlights roads that have more than one bus network traveling upon them. And it's quite amazing, actually, how much coverage there is across London and how the bus routes alone kind of effectively trace a recognizable representation of the city. And they kind of appear like the veins of London. It's kind of cool. And the same data can be used to drill down and look at individual routes, for example, perhaps showing how routes change over time or change day to day as sort of the routes move from the daytimes to night routes only. You can also perhaps take a look at a route and take a look at specific stops. So while not practical in itself, it allows you to start doing some interesting things, like combining that route data with live predictions from buses, say from the TfL API that Tim was talking about, and not only allowing you to work out when a bus is going to arrive at the next stop, but actually where it is right now in physical space. And once you start expanding this approach to all vehicles along a route, you start to sort of gain a better understanding about how the route works and how it's performing. And this isn't just useful for people who use the route, being able to see exactly where the bus is, but it's also useful for transportation agencies to get a much better idea about how their networks are performing and where any problems may be. And so in this example, I've taken that concept and applied it in 3D in a ViziCities scene to sort of give you an interface that gives you more context on what vehicles you're looking at and where they are. So after sort of nailing transport visualization on the ground and below ground, the next logical step is to look above ground, so at things like aircraft. So in the following example, this is using live air traffic data, or at least it's using transponder data, to give you a rough idea of where planes are in 3D space anywhere in the world. And the benefit you get over 2D visualization is that you can actually see the change in elevation of these vehicles as they come into land. So it gives you a much more enhanced understanding of the complexity of something like air traffic and how that is controlled around a busy airport. And with previous visualizations, you can also drill right down into per vehicle visualization as well. So for example, having accurate models depending on the specific plane types. You can see if a small plane's coming into land or a massive A380. And also adding fine-grained information, like actually even the strobe lights and the navigation lights on the plane, so you can tell whether it's sort of what state those planes are in. And a lot of what I've focused on up to this point focuses on vehicles, but you can actually sort of spend some time understanding the infrastructure itself. So what you can see here is an example of some detail I added to the Heathrow representation with individual markings that are on the runway, so at the actual paint marks, including things like the actual runway markers as well. And it gives you a much better understanding as you zoom in of what you're actually looking at, even at an airport, at an infrastructure level. And you can also bring life and energy to these transport infrastructure visualizations by making them look like they're actually being used. And this is something people often overlook. So in this case, I've placed actual planes in real parking spots around the terminals. And it gives you a sense of sort of the airport not being sort of dead and empty anymore, and also acting like a sort of reference point for scale as well. You get a sense of how big these buildings are. And another practical use is visualizing things that haven't actually happened yet. So one obvious use case would be visualizing the third runway at Heathrow and what that might look like and how that might affect the environment around it. So you could also take that concept further by combining that with other data, say proposed or predicted noise pollution, for example, and overlaying that to allow citizens who live nearby to get a much better understanding about what's going to happen and how that might look for them. So an area I touched on earlier is the use of depth and height to add more context to a visualization. So in this example, I've taken GPS data from my Fitbit watch that I collected during a helicopter trip over London last year. And normally you'd visualize these kinds of things on a 2D map, perhaps showing the individual points or more likely a path sort of showing how you traveled around the city. And you may even change the color of the line to show an indication of altitude maybe of the vehicle. But it doesn't look like a path of a helicopter. It could quite easily be the path of a car or a incredibly fast runner. You can't really tell the difference until you dig into it. So by visualizing that exact same data in 3D within something like ViziCities, you immediately get a better sense of not only the scale, but also the change in altitude and the vehicle, the change in altitude that the vehicle went through during its journey. You can zoom right in and look at how the journey started and ended. Suddenly you notice things that didn't show up in 2D, like the massive drop in altitude just after the start. And it's also fun to look at the more interesting parts, like the little detour around the Olympic Stadium, or this really tight and sort of nauseating set of turns that the pilot had to take as he was obeying air traffic control as he moved into London City Airport. And seeing the vehicle on its path alone can only tell you so much. So once you start combining this with other data sources such as buildings, you begin to get a much richer understanding of what's going on. It's obvious how high the vehicle is now and how its journey relates to the surrounding buildings and the city below. So you don't have to try and visualize it in your head anymore, much like you have to do with 2D. So that's really all I have time for today. I'd love to continue talking about this and showing you what other things ViziCities can do and how you can further understand transport data. So please jump on the website or grab me on Twitter. I'm at ViziCities, and I'll be happy to answer any other questions or show you anything else.
Thank you, Robin. Wow.